So importantly, the Rural Financial Counselling Service is a free and confidential service. We're impartial, and I think that's incredibly important to us, and we trade on that confidentiality. People we deal with must be assured that we're going to be providing service, and the conversations that we have will be in confidence. And if we need to talk to other parties, then we'll ensure that we get their permission to do so. As well, we're funded by state and federal government. So just a bit of an overview of the number of services that operate throughout Australia. Some are state-based, others have multiple services within the states. This is an old graphic. Unfortunately, I don't have a more up-to-date one, but what I can point out to you is that the Western and Southern service within New South Wales is now merged, so there are 2 remaining services. And likewise within Victoria, the 2 Western services have also merged, so there are 3 services within Victoria. So that's us. That's where we are, Northeast Victoria, the green patch, and pretty much captures, if you like, the catchments of the Golden Valley and Ovens and Murray. Okay, a bit about what we do. I think if we break it into 2 main components, and that is that we help people with those transactional short-term crisis needs. And I guess I'm always a bit dubious about using the term crisis because, I don't know, the image I often have is someone running around with their shirt on fire or something like that, and it's this urgent need. And the reason I have some I guess, reservations about using the term is that drought sometimes doesn't present that. As we know, it's a slow creep, and it takes a while before it really becomes apparent to us that this is now drought circumstances that we're dealing with. But really what we're dealing with there is people that have got those short-term needs, and to give some examples, it might be during drought, it might be post-fires, floods and the likes, and we're a recovery service that helps them with those short-term needs to get access to various government programs, support, income supports and the like. We also provide case management, and this is probably the more important part to what we do, because I guess what it does is bring about significant change. And whilst we are highly valued for our crisis needs support, it is the structural adjustment that we support clients through that make a everlasting, sustainable change to their life. And so we do that by better understanding their financial position and the business viability. We may help them with their debt management, and that's working with banks and unsecured creditors to put in some sort of a plan. And at times that might be farm debt mediation, which is a process to essentially help banks get their money back. But I will say that our experiences of banks is that they're very much wanting to work with the client. This isn't a sledgehammer approach, and it's about trying to find a resolution and an outcome that their customer is willing to work towards. Business planning, succession planning, transition is something else that we get involved in. I will say it's more pre-succession, so it's about understanding the parties within the business and the different generations and what their needs are, and really getting that down on paper and doing that groundwork. So when they do go off to be it a facilitator or a lawyer or an accountant, that there's not, I guess, too much time spent in working through perhaps that fundamental information that starts the conversation. And we also help with the needs of individuals, so namely the regional, sorry, I've gone blank, RIC, which is a federal government bank that helps primary producers get access to, if you like, more competitive rates, better loans, and that's something that's emerged over the last 3 to 4 years. And excuse me if I've got the timeline wrong. And most importantly, we do refer to service providers And that might be in the way of health needs, or it might also be about professional services. So just a point of clarity, I put this one up to really make, I guess, that visual distinction about our role. And the word counsellor is there because we work in a non-advice or provide a non-advice service. And we don't get involved in personal counselling. And I don't mean to diminish the need for addressing that with clients, because it's really important. And often, there's such a close relationship between mental well-being and financial circumstances. However, I know that there is perhaps a misconception out there, and whenever I get an opportunity, I use that to help people understand that, yes, we will refer to mental health providers or personal counsellors, and we will check in about the well-being of the client. However, it's not our role as rural financial counsellors to provide personal counselling. I think the other thing that's quite important that I perhaps should have mentioned earlier too is that I have a somewhat of a biased view or a narrow view of what happens with primary producers, because we're dealing with people that are in financial difficulty or experienced some sort of natural disaster and are dealing with that. So often in the way I might present, I don't mean to suggest that all farmers are in this boat, but I think it's important just to point out that that's our perspective and that's the cohort that we are dealing with. And sometimes we deal with people that have been in remarkably strong positions and through, be it environmental factors or an illness within the family, or other situations, deliver the service by providing outreach. We go out to the farmer, can sit down with them at the kitchen table and have a conversation. It's really important to develop that rapport and trust and get the client's story. And that allows for, if you like, a more holistic approach to what's going on within their life. In terms of the work that we need to do, it's about better understanding where are you now? And we need to understand how the business has been performing financially. So, a little bit of a review of the profit and loss. We understand what assets and liabilities they currently have. And importantly, it's the capacity and the capability of the individual. And as I mentioned earlier, if their health is at risk or something has happened to really change or compromise their health, then we need to consider that when we start to explore the different options. So understanding the resources that are available to them and the barriers and the underlying issues that are likely to inhibit their decision-making when we start to look at options. Importantly, what we're doing as we work through that process is we're understanding their circumstance, but importantly, we're also checking in with them and we're helping them to understand that too. Often with our clients, they don't necessarily have that line of sight to those key measures to see how their business is performing. As I mentioned, that we get that information to start exploring options and look at ways and means that we can put in some sort of action plan to overcome their circumstances or improve their circumstances. And once again, importantly, we don't do it exclusively. We look at opportunities to bring in third parties, such as professional service providers and healthcares and counsellors and the likes. So what happens when drought or natural disasters occur? Well, the starting point is key to this. A person's resilience or ability to recover is really dependent on the shape of the business before they went into a difficult period. The other thing is that the issues around the limited business acumen, thanks Tim Clune, I've picked up on that language, and it really does, it's about having the appropriate instruments in place to measure the performance of the business and then be able to keep checking in on that. And if there's not an appreciation of the importance of having that information at hand, when you get into a drought, well, it just amplifies some of the difficulties because you will be probably making more decisions in the early stages. you know, and this is, I guess, a lot of these points are around the starting point of people as they go in, but limited available cash and income sources increase exposure to risk and more risk taking. And I guess I've seen it within my own team. Some of our rural financial counsellors are farmers as well, and they're willing to share their own experiences. And given that they have an off-farm income as well as the farm income, they clearly have more options available to them in making decisions about how they'll manage drought conditions and you know, namely destocking. They can afford to destock. They might take a little bit of a loss, but they know that they've got the off-farm income to help mitigate the risk. Whereas a farmer who is solely dependent on that one form of income is more likely to take the risk and keep the stock and feed cattle in the hope that and they can service those overheads and operating costs. One of the important things that I guess what we experienced too was that past resilience doesn't necessarily guarantee future resilience with drought. And there are a couple of circumstances, and Millennium Drought was a good example of that, where a number of dairy farmers that I dealt with during that period were positioning themselves not to really destock or reduce numbers, because their argument was, well, droughts come and go, and if I'm in a strong position to recover and maintain the herd, then I can capitalise on improve input costs and hopefully make a profit when conditions improve. Little did we know that drought would continue for so long, and so that approach didn't prove to be all that robust. And perhaps interesting, what I did see out of that was a younger cohort of farmers, dairy farmers in particular, that were adjusting and changing and introducing infrastructure and other strategies to mitigate the risk of drought, because they saw that they wanted to continue on for many decades afterwards. However, the challenges they had was simply having the resources, the cash available, or the borrowing capacity to be able to do that. We know that financial stress does actually impair people's IQ. I think it's 10, 11 points where it drops as a result of that added stress. And we know through a number of surveys, research and the like, there is such a strong connection between a person's mental well-being and their financial position. The emotional response and their circumstance can really stifle the person's circumstances to how they deal with the situation. Decision paralysis does come about, and we see that perhaps as the drought progresses and the challenges that people have, and they're just fatigued and they don't have the resources. And so in the end, it's a bit of an ostrich approach where they stick their head in the sand and hope it goes away. And of course, the significance of the impact of drought on their financial circumstances, then you know, it's the financial hangover, so to speak, and what that means to their ability to then recover and then be in a position to prepare for the next natural disaster. So I've touched on this, and I won't labour over it too much, but there are barriers to better financial understanding. It's about the well-being. It's about how people prioritise what they use to make decisions, whether it be emotional or analytical in the way that they work through them and make these decisions. Often it might be just a gut feel as to destocking. I think I'll do that, or that's what my neighbour did. I guess there's this, we also, depending on what stage people are within their business life, if you like, whether they're growing a business or whether they're got a view to retirement, and how willing they are to embrace new technologies and new processes and systems. Limited awareness to service providers and support, and I think that's a big one, and particularly with the cohort that we deal with, that they are dependent on information coming to them. They're not particularly good at researching, gathering information, reading material and those sorts of things. And so I think this is one of the reasons why our service is so important, because we rely so heavily personal referrals, and I think it's the strength, particularly in the dairy industry. We see that such a well-connected network industry, and that's not to say that other industries aren't, but we see the value of that strong network and our ability to connect with clients that are in need because of their financial circumstances. So I think the opportunity for us as service providers is the acknowledgement and value of financial understanding during relevant conversations, and helping the client to really build an understanding about how critical that is to supporting their business decision. It's a matter of resourcing, financial capability, capacity. Getting to know other service providers within the region and what they do. And I think one of the most powerful things that I've ever done is joint visits, be it with banks, accountants, even personal counsellors, because it's such an insight to understanding about how they do their job. And for me, that's then I'm better equipped to know in the right time to refer clients to other service providers. And I'll bang on about this quite a bit. I think COVID really exacerbated this and made us aware that the value of personal referrals. And when you provide a referral to a client, what you often do is you give them reason as to why they should connect with another service provider, why they should talk to the bank, why they should talk to a rural financial counsellor, why they should go and talk to their accountant. And probably my experience as being a rural financial counsellor is I discovered that when I gave people a practical need to connect with another service provider, they were more likely to take up that referral. And I found that probably one of the things that I often came back to. And a simple example with personal referrals to counsellors, when I simply suggested that a counsellor might help them come out and switch off at night with that racing brain and better sleep at night, that was a practical need that they had. And I actually discovered that through that change in language and how I was referring, I started to get a much greater uptake of that offer of the referral. So that's our national contact details. It's Rural Financial Counselling Network Group, and it's just it's a website and a national number that we now have as a collective group to make it easier to promote our service when it's on a broader scale. Key message I always leave with, please get in touch with your local rural financial counsellors. I really believe it's people at the front line that can make that world of difference to primary producers and those that we deal with. We're at the front line. We have an opportunity to make those personal referrals, and we're all the better for knowing who the different service providers are within our local area. So that's about it, Fiona, unless there's some questions.
Thanks, Chris. Look, I've already got a lot of questions going through my mind. There's a lot of thought, a lot of thinking going on, but I'm conscious of time. So what I might do is get you to join the Q&A panel at the end of the next session. And then we can have a really robust discussion at the end of the next session. So thank you very much for your presentation, Chris. It's a valuable service that's been provided, but one that we actually in the future would love to potentially not need. So look, moving forward, I'd like to introduce the industry panel, and we've been really lucky to secure 4 people working very heavily in the agricultural sector supporting our farming community. So first of all, we've got Phil White, who's an agronomist and consultant with Ag Diagnostics working in Southwest Victoria. We've got Clinton Peake, who's an accountant working for ProAdvice, and he works across Victoria, South Australia and Tasmania. Greg Kugel, he's a regional bank manager for Western Victoria working with Rural Bank, and Rebecca Casey, farm business coach, who works for an organisation called The Nature of Business and based in Gippsland. So what we've asked each of the industry panel to do is just to provide a bit of insight into the way that they're working with their clients and what they are seeing is working really well, and perhaps identifying some of the areas of concern as an industry for farmers where they might not necessarily be doing everything that they could be to start building farm business resilience. And so at the end of that session, Chris, we'll get you to jump back into a Q&A. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Phil White, who's an agronomist and consultant with Ag Diagnostics, just to talk a little bit about what he is doing and how he's working with his clients and the role he plays. So Phil. Just need to jump off mute. Phil, there you go. Welcome. Great.
Good. Right, I'm not the best at these Zoom things, but we'll see how we go. So I'm Phil White I'm the principal of Ag Diagnostics. We're based in Hamilton in southwest Victoria. Got myself and a couple of other agronomists working here. It's interesting what you call yourself. I started off doing agronomy, I suppose, but that's morphed over the years into sort of doing everything, I suppose, on farm. What do you want to put on your business card? Do a fair bit of ruminant nutrition as well, and we morph into looking at the whole farm business. Also own and operate a dairy and dairy beef business myself. In some ways, I'm a little bit of the odd one out. We have a good viable dairy and dairy beef business, and sort of somehow managed to fit this in as well. Our client base is from Penola to Colac, mostly within sort of an hour's drive of the coast, so it'll be mostly all high rainfall zone. Probably a third dairy, third sheep and beef, and a third other, the other being some forestry work, and just forestry and some new venture analysis, but a bit of asset management stuff as well. Just whatever comes along. Their main businesses are a subscription-based, it's fee-for-service agronomy farm consultancy. So we're 100% fee-for-service. We don't sell anything, which puts us in a reasonably unique position in our area, I suppose, from an agronomy and ruminant nutrition point of view. You ask how we work with farmers, or how I work with farmers. One of the big things that was probably mentioned on before is do a lot of cash flow budgeting and scenario analysis. So it's not compared to, say, a reseller agronomist or a reseller nutritionist. It's not about just going what we think we should do. It's about putting the whole farm business picture together. Looking at if we're doing a development program, that will be doing a cash flow budget with it to show how that will impact on cash flow. When the money will come back in. So we're trying to look at the whole business the whole time, not just sometimes what's biologically correct is not always what fits in with what's coming in and out of the bank account as well. So one of the I've probably got a spreadsheet for everything. So spent a lot of time doing scenario analysis on the people and looking at what changes if they're going to make, what they will do to their business. Things that work when we look at the dairy space, which is a third of my business. We have monthly meetings with farmers scheduled, so that's, I'd say, a recurring meeting. So the second Tuesday on every month, I'll be at one dairy. The third Wednesday, I'll be at another one. So they're scheduled. That works in really well for farmers. Makes that their priority be there for that. They have to have some information prepared for me before we go to it. So it's like a snapshot in time of where the business is at. Things like cow production, fodder on hand, all that sort of thing. I have access to the Xero accountancy files on a number of businesses as well, sheep and beef and dairy, and and that can work. So we can pull the reconciled data out of the accountancy stuff and compare where they're at compared to what our budget was. That's a really handy tool that works well. And we'll match that up with preparing a feed budget for the 12 months ahead, can be even further than that. So, looking at rough numbers, on an average year on a dryland dairy farm in southwest Victoria, you're probably looking at needing 10 kilo of dry matter of forage on hand for 100 to 150 days in a normal year. But in reality, you really need sort of to be able to hand feed cows for sort of 240 days or 8 months. And that's almost the scenario that we're in this year on some of the really coastal strip. Like there are some, as you get further towards the border and closer to the coast, it's actually been a pretty average year. So some farms have been feeding since December and are still feeding now, which is a lot for us down here. So we're looking at having strategies to ensure that we can have that fodder on hand. Sealed bunkers. You might have an inventory fodder of a ton to a ton and a half per cow, but there needs to be another ton that's not within the working inventory put aside as well. It's about putting money aside and fodder aside for that sort of thing. So the sheep and beef sector is probably not as good at that, I would, as a general comment, in terms of particularly the fodder front. They tend to rely on just buying grain and perhaps contracting or storing some grain and feeding grain where necessary. But when you get into a late break scenario and you can't feed grain anymore and you've got lambing ewes now, I see that as a real issue in the sheep and beef sector. Another thing that I see in the sheep and beef sector on that is that we've got significant agribusinesses. With the cost and value of land, your average, I don't want to put a number on it, but it's really not hard at all to have a $20 million agribusiness. And I always make the argument that if you can't afford to have a couple of $100,000 worth of fodder put aside, whether that's a sealed silage bunker or hay or whatever, you really shouldn't be doing what you're doing. And we're talking sort of 1% of total business value, and yet not many people are prepared to do that. So I make that case reasonably strongly. I'm probably running out of time, and I could talk about this all day. So we develop incredibly strong relationships with our clients. It's just amazing what you end up knowing or sorting out. But that's part of being a fee-for-service scenario, I suppose. And if I had to say issues to look at, a lot of people get advice from resellers, and there are some great resellers out there. I don't want to sound like I'm knocking resellers, but one of the things that resellers do is they often try to, particularly the younger cohort with a little bit less experience coming on, they often try to build relationships by cutting costs, like cutting input costs and that sort of thing, because for a couple of reasons. I think the numbers are often quite scary. They don't have enough experience with the numbers, and they think one of the ways to build a relationship is to save money, where often that's the worst thing you can do. Like, phosphorus looked pretty cheap 2 or 3 years ago, and we were going incredibly hard on that with a number of clients. And now that we're in the scenario with $7 a kilo P, that we can pull back a little bit. Whereas you find a lot of resellers will try to cut the total business, the bill down for fertiliser and that sort of thing, because they think that's building a relationship. The farmer likes that, whereas that's actually the worst thing you can often do. They actually often need to go harder on inputs. If we're looking at moisture or drought or available water as a limiting factor, if you don't have your soil fertility right, your kilograms of dry matter grown per millimetre of rain are going to go down. So that's contributing to it. So I think that's a bit of an issue. So if we look at resellers as probably the biggest cohort out there giving advice to farmers, often they don't have a lot of financial literacy around an actual farm business. So they're giving, they might be doing a fertilizer plan or a regrassing plan or a nutrition plan, but that's really in a box. It's not within the whole farm business scenario. They don't actually know that there's where the overdraft's sitting at any particular point in the year or how that's going to impact along. And often because it's not as close a relationship as they have on a fee-for-service basis, the farmers won't give that information out either. So they might use someone like myself that goes through all that information, and then they obviously and buy things through a reseller, but there's often not quite enough calibration. And the other one is a lot of the resellers are just too busy. If my book is full, I can't really take on anymore. And I can just say that, but if you're a reseller and you're a good agronomist, they'll just they'll get overwhelmed, and then they simply don't have the time to, because they're trying to make money selling products. So you simply don't have the time to spend on that additional stuff. I must be well out of time, am I?
Oh, look, thanks, Bill. It's everything that you're saying is resonating, and I'm really keen for us to be able to move into that Q&A session, and particularly keen to explore what you're saying about supporting new entrants into the agribusiness sector, about with business acumen, so they can actually support their clients in a more holistic way, rather than, as you say, trying to build those relationships simply by trying to cut their input costs. That's a really great observation, and something we can talk about further. But conscious of time, so we will move through the next speaker, Clinton Peake. Clinton is an accountant with ProAdvice. So keen to understand, Clinton, how you're working with clients, what you're observing with your client base, and sort of maybe identifying some of the things that people are doing really well and maybe some of the stumbling blocks.
Sure. Thanks, Fiona. And thanks very much, Kirsten, for putting this together, and everyone for attending. I think progressive people looking to better themselves is actually part of what we seek to work with. To start with, what doesn't work, and very clearly will come through with all of the various advisors, is operating in a silo. I'm a firm believer that all advisors have overlap, and ultimately one of the key takeaways is that farmers and producers need to choose their team, and ultimately the team that they trust, because if trust isn't in the room, then advice won't be taken. And I think that really relates to bankers, agronomists, accountants, consultants, coaches, the whole gamut. And we like to work with a team approach, starting with strategy and holistic management. So topic of the day being drought. Fundamentally, what happens in drought, as was picked up in Chris's talk, is that we get analysis paralysis, and we're very clear 3 weeks after the event what we should have done 3 weeks ago, but it's terribly difficult at the time to make those decisions. So just a huge believer in planning before crises, when you're sane and rational and mulling it over with people you trust. And ultimately, to do that well, the professional jealousy of protecting your patch needs to be overcome somehow. And whether we're talking input costs or professional services costs, to come back to the basic value equation, which says something like measure the benefit to be gained divided by the price to be paid to determine whether something is of value or not. So we see lots and lots and lots of tax accountants who do 1 year by 1 year tax returns, basically deliver no advice. And our argument would be, regardless of the cost, it's probably expensive, and you could pay a whole lot more in money and the value is actually greater if the benefit is commensurately greater. So that would be my first takeaway. Start with strategy and holistic management. Put your team together with the skill sets required to deal with the problems at hand, whether that's in an advisory board or whether that's in whatever form you like. The farmers who work best actually do that process in some way, shape or form, and they deal with things in policy well before crises eventuates. So just like there's many categories of farmers, all are not created equal. I would say the same for advisors, and some due diligence on advisors should occur. We do think it's important, obviously, as accountants, that you know your numbers. To this point, it doesn't lie that the top 25% by benchmark generally make good decisions and make money, and the bottom 25% don't. So if we don't know what the benchmarks are, then any road will do. So by hook or by crook, you do need to know what your current state of play is, but also pretty important to know where you're trying to get to. So in measuring risk-weighted decisions, what is success and what does it look like? Again, that's a different answer for different families. And as accountants, we tend to reflect back to people what they're telling us their goals actually are, and we're trying to help them achieve it. And playing as greater or as lesser a role actually in achieving those goals as the family needs. Balancing people, profit and environment, a bit of a throwaway line, but at any given time, particularly livestock producers are measuring their grass bank, their cashet bank and their livestock bank, and in some respects cycling through those three things and trying to find balance and harmony. Cropping's not dissimilar with the rotation and the agronomic production plan needing to be matched to the financial plan, needing to be matched to the banking. So you can see this combination of advisors to all achieve the same thing rather than silos where each might be steering in a different direction and the family themselves being pulled in all different ways. Another little takeaway I would give you, no matter what business you're in or what enterprise you're running, you're in the people business. So accountants often are thought only to think about finance, but good accountants, I believe, will be thinking about the family and their goals, which of course has a financial overlay, but will also have off-farm succession, fairness, equality overlays. And to talk to tools is a mistake. What you need to do first is to work out where you're trying to go. And then the tools are the things, the levers that you have in your back pocket to try and achieve those outcomes. So I think if we're talking drought specifically, we need to have a drought policy. And if any people on the call don't have a drought policy, that would be my next takeaway. Now is the time, not when you're in it. And the drought policy should establish the purpose, what it is that you're actually trying to do, the targets, in other words, what are the not negotiables. We did a 25-year study where we found out most head were sold at the lowest price at the worst possible time, and the least amount of head were sold at the highest price at the best possible time. To me, that's just a lack of planning. So when times are good, we should be planning for when they're not. So when they're not, we can essentially roll out the plan we've already got, trusting that when we weren't under personal stress, we could make better decisions. your drought policy should also identify the how you're going to do that, which is specific, measurable, achievable, realistic. Who's responsible for bringing it to the agenda, to the table, and ultimately how often you're going to review it to make sure it's relevant as life stage challenges change. So quite conscious of time. 5 minutes is not long, but hopefully a few things there for us to pick up a bit later on, Fiona.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Clinton. I'm already picturing you delivering a whole lot of professional development for the accountant sector across Australia. So well done. Thank you. We'll come back to you at the Q&A session. Next speaker is Greg Kukul. Greg is Regional Bank Manager for Rural Bank in Western part of Victoria and working across a huge region and seeing a lot of clients and a lot of businesses. So Greg, very keen to get your insight too into what you're seeing across the industry.
Thanks, Fiona. I'll try and conscious time, so I'll keep it moving. But I think I just wanted to maybe just when it comes to banks, maybe just put a bit of context around probably the word advice. And I think banks or bankers obviously often walk a very tight rope around advice. And the reason to put a bit of context to that is that bank managers aren't covered by professional indemnity insurance. And I suppose when you then have a look at the Royal Commission into banking a couple of years ago, you see examples where banks, which probably at the time thought they were doing the right thing, or bank managers at the right time were doing the right thing, and probably overstepped the mark on advice, and it really came back to bite them in the bank. And if I can use a couple of really simple examples, the typical scenario at the moment, we're in a rising interest rate market. The first thing everybody asks their bank is, should I lock in? And banks are really careful about what they say in that situation, because it can come back and grab you bite you later on if things go the other way. The other one is about helping with regards to cash flow budgets and so forth, which in the past banks were quite active in doing that and helping, but at the same time, we're now in a position where we shouldn't really be getting involved in that, because it's whose cash flow is it that's helping make decisions around lending money. So, as I said, banks are very cautious about providing advice, and we're probably relying more and more now on consultants. And probably in a way, I actually personally find that a bit disappointing, because I think bank managers have a huge amount to offer in regards to, we have a great network of clients, people, businesses we see, what we see other people doing, and a lot of value to add. But it's trying to provide that insight to our clients at the same time without trying to tell them what to do, in essence, I suppose. So so I suppose that, how can we help farmers make good financial decisions? And I think there's two parts. Is one, when things are good and when things aren't good. So when things are good, very much encouraging more and more cash flow budgeting. Farmers are getting better at it, but there's still a lot out there that don't understand the value in a good cash flow budget. And some people go to sleep when I start talking about cash flow budgets, but it's critical that it's only when people really realise the value in it that they think, oh, now I can actually see why I need to be doing this. So that's something that we try and encourage a lot of people to be doing. Encouraging buffers in their business, and as it's exactly the same as Phil mentioned, it's not uncommon now to see businesses, an average business sitting on a $20 million asset. Have they got a fodder reserve of $200,000 or $300,000 in cash or fodder or something that's sitting away there to cover them for a business of that scale? And as again, encouraging people to use farm business consultants to help them plan and budget and work their way, get themselves set up so that they are ready for when a drought inevitably comes. I suppose one of the issues that we find is that there's actually a lack of consultants in a lot of areas. There's some areas that seem to be quite well covered by independent consultants. A lot of areas that we try and, if a client, we see some value with that for a client, we'll try and give them 2 or 3 names and numbers and say, look, have a chat to the 3 of you, make your own decision. But some places we even struggle to find the consultants that can work in that area. During droughts, really our role is what I would call patching holes in cash flows. We end up with client after client, running through cash flows, and really what we're trying to do is fund a short-term gap until the next production cycle, because we can't, until the next crop comes in, or the next wool sale, or the next lamb sale, you can't really work out exactly where they're going, when's the drought going to break. So it's really reactionary when we get to that point in time. And look, some people, when you get to that point, some people know really well where they're at and where they're heading. Other people literally bury their head in the sand until it's too late, and then come knocking on the door after that. Farmers do generally listen to banks knowledge and I suppose influence, but I think sometimes people struggle to make the decisions on the back of that as well. They probably get a bit confused. I mean, as I mentioned, I think banks really do have a lot to offer. You know, we're probably in that unique scenario where we do get an insight into the production side of a business, but also the financial aspects of the business. So it is. I think there's certainly some there to offer there. What works best? Very much it's the ongoing discussions and what I'd call challenging farmers. Being a bank, you're pretty commonly asked the question, well, what happens if something doesn't quite go right? What happens if, what's the risk here? Those type of things. So that tends to be how we try and bring out those conversations with farmers to get them thinking about where you're going into this proposal or expansion. What happens if it doesn't quite go to plan? What's your approach going to be here? What happens if you do hit a drought in 3 years' time? What's your plan and approach? And as I said before, the best time to do that is while things are good, not while things are bad. While things are good, you've got options, you've got time to be able to do those sort of things. Working with other advisors, I think banks generally work pretty well with accountants. We do seem to get on generally pretty well there. Rural financial counsellors work well, but as was mentioned earlier, it's probably only when things are going bad that we have a lot of time spent with rural financial counsellors. At a time like now where generally things are going well, we don't have a lot of that interaction. And one area where I think we need to work far better with is with agronomists, and I'll touch on that in a second. So I think for improvements, as I mentioned, I don't think banks and agronomists talk enough, and I'm putting banks as well as an agronomist as the blame for that. I'm not blaming one or the other. And I think the background, farmers want to keep their financial position confidential, which is fair enough. But I still think there's better ways that we can work together. And if I can give an example, you run through a drought for 2 or 3 years in a cropping scenario, and then we hit the next year, which is the drought breaker. The season's looking really good. The agronomist is saying is trying to grow the most profitable crop, which is their job, which is fantastic. So they're trying to pushing input costs and those sort of things. But the clients, if the clients don't share their cash flow with the agronomist, the agronomist is going in blind about what the farmer's financial capability is to actually be able to fund that crop. And often we get this compounding scenario where you've got an agronomist trying to push for the most profitable crop, and then you've got a bank trying to hold back and say, well, hang on a minute, we can't give you the cash flow you need to be able to do this. So the two of us need to be talking better to make sure that they can grow a crop that's as profitable can be, but within the realms of a client's cash flow as well. So that's one where I think we really need to spend more time together. And I really think banks and agronomists need to be part of that annual review process when it comes to looking at, well, what's the cropping plan for the year ahead and what's actually financially viable for someone to do. More improvements, plan, prepare in the good years when you have options. As I said, when it comes to drought, you run out of options. A drought plan is, as was mentioned before, exactly. A written one's even better, especially those farmers with livestock and permanent plantings. Someone with an annual cropping program, you can shut the checkbook in August and say, well, the crops we'll work out what we're going to do next season. But for those with live, their decision or their triggers around, there's two choices in the end of the day. Do I buy fodder or do I destock? And what are the triggers that's going to make me decide that's the time that I'm going to buy fodder, or I'm going to start selling early, or what am I going to do? So I think that's a really important one. Obviously, coming from a bank's perspective, farm management deposits, they're good, but they're not great, would be the way I'd put it. I think farm management deposits have become probably superannuation for some farmers, and they have a lot of trouble getting that money out of their FMDs. They wouldn't have enough bad seasons to be able to pull them out. How do we get the farmers that really need them to actually use them? So that's probably I think there's a bit of an inequity in the people that are using FMDs. And for a lot of people, they see farm management deposits as a tax management tool and not as a way of preparing for droughts. So I think that's sort of an area that probably needs a bit of address. And look, the final concern I'd probably have, which is probably me just sitting back and stewing over this a bit, is that for the last 20 or 25 years, when we've experienced droughts and times of prolonged droughts, it's also been occurred during a time of us seeing asset values increasing at the same time. And so people's ability to I suppose, fund their way or borrow their way through a cash flow shortage in a drought has been backed up by an improving asset value over that period of time. And I suppose what concerns me is that, we're going into a different economic cycle now where potentially asset values won't be increasing as quickly, even though people are in a good financial position now. 2 or 3 years drought, they start chewing up a bit of that equity, interest rates are higher, those type of scenarios. What would happen if we had 2 or 3 years of drought and we didn't have the escalating asset values behind it for people to be able to borrow against? I suppose that's probably just a question I'd pose that I don't necessarily have the answer to, but that's probably a bit of a concern from that perspective if we had scenarios like we've had in the past, but didn't have the asset values that were going up at the same time. So that's probably my summary, Fiona. I hope that helps.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does, Greg. Thank you. And yeah, the implications of the Royal Commission are certainly ongoing. And not saying that it was necessarily a bad thing, but it certainly has had implications moving forward in how bank managers and bank personnel, can interact with their clients. And many other things that you've mentioned we'll jump to in the Q&A. But finally, I'd like to introduce Rebecca Casey. So Rebecca is a farm business coach working for The Nature of Business based out of Gippsland. Yeah, really interested to hear your thoughts, Rebecca, around everything that you've heard today, but also your perspective in what you're seeing with your clients.
Thanks heaps, Fiona, and it is great to be here. It is always so hard to go last because everyone touches on all my points and I'm kind of crossing them off as everyone else is speaking. I am Rebecca Casey. I am from South Gippsland. Like Phil, I am also a dairy farmer. So I get up every single morning with my husband and milk my cows, and I do my farm coaching basically in between milkings. The farm coaching came about for me during the 2016 milk crisis. I spent so much time working on people's cost of productions, their break-even prices, and basically building plans about how they were going to get through. That was a forced upon crisis on dairy farmers, whereas drought is a lot different to that. But that's how my role came about. During that time, I learned very quickly that the terminology that gets thrown around in business doesn't match farmers. They have no idea what we're actually talking about when we're talking about risk management, when we're talking about business planning, when we're talking about cost of production, all of that kind of stuff. So what I learned to do is change the terminology in the way that I spoke to farmers. So instead of going into farm businesses and going, okay, let's sit down and do a risk management plan for drought, it would be a lot different. It would be, so what would happen if? And by starting the thinking process before the crisis actually happens, when by the time you get around to it, and down here in South Gippsland, it's very rare, they've already got a plan. They've already thought about it. It may not be a written plan a lot of the time, but that's where other consultants also come in. We can take what they have thought about, what their plan, and write it down. Then they've got a really good starting foundation. Like everyone has said, farmers have to they're fantastic at farming. They are some incredible problem-solving thinkers. They are really, really good at that. But they can't be absolutely brilliant at everything. And so when it comes to building teams around them, they really, really do have to have a great relationship with their bank manager. They have to have a great relationship with their accountant. They need to build not only a farm team of your agronomists and nutritionists and everything else to deal with the day-to-day farm stuff, they have to build a really great, trusted business team behind them as well. So the ones that I find that have the capability to build that trusted team, and like Phil said, a once a month meeting, everyone jumps on a Zoom call together, include everyone. It might only be 15 minutes. Everyone has their own bits of information that they need to go, right, this month we're on track. Right, we're a little bit down this month on production. Have you reached out to your nutritionist, or what's going on in the paddock? If you actually plan and set all this time aside and build that team around you, then you'll find that you're going to have a really resilient business. So my biggest takeaways is change the terminology when you're talking to farmers. because by changing it, you're opening up those lines of communication, building the teams around them, let them do what they do best, and that's being out in the paddock. So really encouraging that team building.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, a lot of food for thought, and well, I guess if people are happy, I'm keen to jump into sort of a Q&A. We've got a few minutes, and I'm conscious that people online won't be able to necessarily ask their question verbally, but if they can put it in the chat, I'll do my best to grab them from there to talk to. And there has been a question raised in the chat from Stephen around the application of all of this thinking, across all sizes of farms. So not just those that have the 20 million farm asset, but, that are operating at a much smaller scale. What's the capacity? And maybe can talk to you, Phil, initially, what's the capacity of people who, to be able to apply this sort of thinking across all farm sizes? And we just need to take you off mute, I think, Phil.
It's all relative, I suppose. The same principles apply. It's just scale it down further.
Phil, I had a question for you about fodder on hand and reserves on hand. How many of your clients would actually have that capacity or are able to do that and are actively doing it?
I'd say more than half of them would actually have that sort of reserve. And I'd say the other half, because I'm always banging on about it, are working towards that.
Yeah, and is there, I guess, what are the barriers to them being able to implement it relatively quickly? Is it the fact that they don't have storage on farm and they're trying to build infrastructure, or?
A lot of it in the dairy space, it's much easier because they're generally set up for feeding silage. The best, the easiest way to do it is in a buried bunker for that non-tradable silage stack. So as I said, you might need a tonne to a tonne and a half per cow in terms of your tradable stack, and then you might need to be another tonne put aside that's for the really bad times. And the dairy industry is often set up to be able to do that, whereas sheep and beef side, you've got to do it with, a lot of them aren't set up to feed silage and that sort of thing, and tend to do it with grain, and hay doesn't store as well. There's that's probably a bit of an inhibition to it. But I've got some quite large scale beef producers that have exactly that. They've got a provision there to feed the core breeding herd basically for a couple of 100 days. So whatever happens, they can carry on and at least have a year up your sleeve to make a decision. The other thing, when you look at it on that, and I hate to go the other way, but the most money you make is out of everyone else's misfortune. And if you've got that up your sleeve, it's often, if you look at the cattle market, was it 3 years ago now, we had people buying cattle out of the north, breaking into their drought reserve when we were actually okay, because the opportunity was just too good. You could buy cow and calf units for, $500, $600, $700 and feed them for 3 or 4 months, and suddenly that turned into a hell of a lot more cash flow, which then drove a lot of business progression. So it's probably the exact opposite, but the reality is there's a lot of money to be made out of other people's misfortune and drought in Australia.
Yeah, I guess that's about, revisiting the plan regularly, and having those regular touch points to say, well, okay, well, that's why I had that feed on hand, and now I'm changing the strategy, and yeah, it's about having that regular contact point. Clinton, I was interested in your point around, building trust and building that team. How do we get the sector to really confidently do that? What's the mechanism to make that happen? Is that you just working with clients and you proactively helping them build their team, or how does the industry go about doing that?
Yeah, if you think of this as a circle, it's actually any point in the circle can take the lead. And this is where I think people who need to be led by people who feel strongly about it. So I would suggest the 70 odd people on this call, my suggestion would be take the lead. So if your advisors are not prepared to speak to other people in the chain, are they the right advisors? And if you suggest that they are, then silos will continue. If you say no, if you're not prepared to work as a team, I'm going to be forced to look elsewhere, then integration will occur. I just think you need to be strong in your belief about whether you really believe this or not. So picking up Phil's comment there about nimbleness, being really clear about what business you're really in, taking opportunity when it presents and mitigating risk on the other side. Does anyone on the call really think you can do that in a vacuum?
Yeah, no, good point. I want to jump back to the chat, and Stephen, apologies if I didn't ask the question articulately enough. But Stephen is suggesting, it's more than just scale that perhaps we need to be thinking about. I think that's far too simplistic. So it's got there in the chat, the psychology of the people, their ability to access information and support, their level of education, their own time to be off farm are very different compared to, bigger producers. So yeah, keen to think about that a little bit more and what our role is to support, farming situations that are in a different situation.
But I suppose just to try and be really clear, whether it's Chris, the accountant, and the banker working together potentially at the distressed end of the market, or whether it's Phil, the accountant, the banker, the lawyer working at the expansion and succession end of the market. The reality is, in both cases, there will be a team of people working on the business to try and help. It's just picking the right team for the circumstance.
Would it be fair to say that the relationship between the independents or the fee-for-service professionals are often better than when you throw the reselling side into it as well? Like, for instance, I'd have clients that would have the accountant who would email me and say, Phil, what are the costs? Oh, we're doing the budget. I've got one in particular I'm thinking at. We're doing the 12-month cash flow. We've just completed it. So I've sent what I think we'll spend, and then we'll go through it on a Zoom call. It's overseas owners. We'll go through it on a Zoom call next month. So the two of us will be in the room, but then it's very hard to engage any of the big box retailers involved with that, because they just don't have the time, and yet they're a big part of the business, but they don't have the time. They can't. How can they justify their weekly meeting when they've spent 4 hours on budgeting in a Zoom call with you and I, or whatever it is, because that's not core business for them.
So ultimately, I think that emerges, doesn't it? I would be careful of putting anybody in a box. I do think it's about people and getting the right people, but you are right. Some systems of work are prohibitive, whereas other systems of work are more malleable. But if you clear what your outcome is, actually the rest will take care of itself, in my view.
True.
Yeah, look, I'm conscious of time. I feel like this discussion we could go on, and I've written down a lot of notes, particularly the people side of things, the planning, building that team, trying to move out of these silos, so building greater relationships between advisors to support the people within the business, and obviously doing it at a time when you are fit and healthy and mentally prepared and in a state to do it. That whole IQ concept of dropping, by 10 points in times of stress, that's something that we really should be taking consideration of. And look, there is those, 4, really key stages of drought, I suppose, that we need to be thinking about. It's not just, the good times and leading up to drought and then in drought, but it's also recovering from drought. So having all those, all those strategies in place for, all those what if scenarios, to at least have had those discussions and thought about it, and having the regular touch points back into it. Just because you had the conversation about it 12 months ago doesn't mean that it's still relevant today. It's that regular check-in that needs to be occurring, which is definitely a key theme. So look, thank you very much for putting your thoughts to us today, and Tim Cummins has got the job of pulling it all together at the end of the session in terms of some key takeaways. I guess we want to say that this is the start of the conversation, because as the Victoria Drought Hub, we've actually been given a great opportunity to actually spend some think time around this, and hopefully some resources around what it is that we can actually do in response to this. So it's great to understand the context and identify some of those barriers and some actions. But the real challenge is, okay, now we've got all of this information, what is it that we can actually really, really do as an industry to make some tangible, on the ground impacts? And so hopefully that's what the Victoria Drought Hub can facilitate.